Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we follow James and Diep as they move into their new home. What begins as an exciting new chapter quickly turns into a test of endurance when a violent storm hits, tearing through the quiet countryside and scattering their belongings into the night. As rain floods the path and the wind howls through half-finished walls, the couple must fight to protect not just their home, but the hope they've built together. Through every soaked box and broken roof tile, James and Diep discover that home isn't just a place. It's the strength to rebuild, side by side. Stay with us until the end for this heartfelt journey. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. The afternoon had started bright and calm, a perfect day for moving into their new home. But by the time the last truckload arrived, gray clouds had rolled in, heavy and unforgiving. Within minutes, the sky opened up, and sheets of rain came crashing down. Diep stood under the porch, her hair clinging to her cheeks, watching helplessly as James fought against the storm. He was hauling the last few boxes from the truck, his clothes already soaked through. "James, leave it. It's just things," she shouted over the wind, her voice trembling between worry and frustration. But James, stubborn as ever, just flashed that familiar grin, the one that said, "I've got this. Only a few more. We can't let the water ruin the furniture," he called back, his tone steady despite the chaos around them. The storm howled, bending the banana trees by the fence. Water streamed down the path, sweeping away a few smaller boxes. Diep's heart twisted as she saw one tumble into the muddy ditch. "James, the kitchen box," she gasped, darting out before he could stop her. Cold rain slapped her face, stinging her eyes. She grabbed the box, heavy and slick, nearly slipping in the mud before James rushed over to steady her. "You shouldn't be out here," he scolded, his voice firm but soft at the edges. They stood there for a second, drenched and shivering, surrounded by flying leaves and wind that roared like an angry sea. Then James took the box from her arms and nodded toward the porch. "Go inside. I'll get the rest." "James, please. I'll be quick." And just like that, he was gone again into the downpour. Inside, Diep tried to keep busy, drying the floor, checking which boxes had survived. But her hands were shaking too much to focus. The thunder rolled again, deep and menacing. She thought about all they'd been through to get here. The long nights, the arguments with family, the debts, the disbelief from everyone who said they couldn't do it. This house was more than walls and a roof. It was proof that they had built something from nothing. When James finally stumbled back in, soaked to the bone, she dropped the rag and rushed to him. "You're freezing," she said, grabbing a towel from the pile. "You're going to get sick again." He laughed softly, brushing her wet hair from her face. "I've been through worse storms, Diep. This one's not taking me down." The lights flickered, as if agreeing to fight the darkness too. Together, they started assembling the bed frame, the first piece of furniture in their new home. The hammer's rhythm filled the small room, a steady beat against the howling rain. "Hold it still," James said, tightening a bolt. Diep crouched beside him, holding the plank with trembling fingers. "This thing's shaking more than me," she muttered, her nervous laugh cutting through the tension. James chuckled. "That's because you're scared it won't fit. But see, it's perfect." When they finally lifted the frame upright, both exhaled at once. The room looked less empty now. The faint glow from the single lamp reflected on the damp wood, and for a brief moment, the storm outside seemed distant. Diep looked around, her eyes softening. "It's starting to feel like home." James nodded, wiping his forehead. "We made it, didn't we? Every brick, every tile, it's ours." But their calm didn't last long. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the half-closed window, sending a spray of rain inside. Papers flew, and one box toppled, spilling its contents across the floor. Diep gasped and ran to close the shutters, but the wind was too strong. James grabbed her arm, pulling her back before the window frame cracked under the pressure. "Forget it. It's not worth it." Rain splattered across the wooden floor, soaking the blankets and one of Diep's dresses. She sank to her knees, frustrated tears mixing with raindrops. "Everything's getting ruined." James crouched beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It's just stuff. We'll dry them tomorrow." His voice was calm, the same tone he used every time life tried to knock them down. Still, Diep's lips trembled. "We worked so hard, James. Every time something good happens, something else gets taken away." He looked at her for a moment before speaking quietly. "Maybe it's just testing us again, but I promise you, we're not losing anything this time." Their eyes met, and despite the cold, warmth bloomed between them. She reached out, brushing his cheek. "You always sound so sure." He smiled faintly. "Because I have you." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, they built something stronger: hope. Hours passed before the worst of the rain eased. They sat side by side on the half-assembled bed, listening to the steady drumming on the roof. James took out his phone, checking the messages. His expression tightened. "What is it?" Diep asked. "The stream behind the house. It's overflowing," he said. "If it gets any higher, we can't drive back tonight." Diep's stomach nodded. "Ni." He immediately called Huyen's mother, his voice steady despite the worry in his eyes. "Stay indoors, okay? Keep Ni away from the water. We'll come as soon as it's safe." When he hung up, he leaned back against the wall, exhaling heavily. "They're fine," he said, "but the road's blocked." Diep bit her lip, staring at the muddy water pooling outside the door. "Then we'll wait it out. Maybe tomorrow the rain will stop." She tried to sound hopeful, but her voice cracked. James pulled her close, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "Tomorrow will be better," he whispered. "It always is." They sat like that for a long time, the dim light flickering as the night deepened. Around them, the wind softened, and the sound of rain became less of a roar and more of a lullaby. Despite the scattered boxes and ruined clothes, the unfinished house radiated something unshakable: faith. Faith that every storm, no matter how fierce, would pass. And for the first time that night, Diep allowed herself to smile. The next morning arrived cloaked in mist. The rain had finally slowed, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the gray sky. The air smelled of wet earth and sawdust, the kind of scent that reminded Diep of renewal. James was already outside when she woke, sweeping away branches and checking what had survived the night. His shirt clung damply to his back, but he seemed unfazed. "Morning," she called softly from the porch, her voice still raspy with sleep. He turned, flashing her a tired smile. "Morning. The good news? The roof held up. Bad news. We lost a few boxes." Her heart sank as she stepped closer, her bare feet brushing against soaked cardboard scattered near the fence. One of the boxes had split open, spilling out plates, framed photos, and a few pieces of clothing now caked in mud. Diep crouched down, gently picking up a photo frame. The glass had cracked, but behind it was a picture of the three of them, James, Nye, and her, smiling on their old porch. Her fingers trembled slightly as she wiped the mud away. "We can replace everything," she whispered, "but not this." James leaned beside her, watching quietly. "That's why I went out last night," he said softly. "Some things are worth getting soaked for." She gave him a half smile, brushing away the moisture in her eyes. "You and your heroic ideas," she teased, but her voice carried warmth now, not frustration. They spent the next few hours salvaging what they could. Diep dried clothes on a makeshift line, while James gathered broken wood for repairs. The storm had scattered more than just boxes. It had torn off part of their shed roof, knocked over a few young grapefruit saplings, and flooded the small path leading to the stream. But as the sun began to peek through the clouds, the house no longer looked defeated. Mud-streaked and imperfect, it stood tall, just like them. "Looks like we'll need to replace that whole section," James said, pointing to the shed's roof. Diep nodded, shielding her eyes from the growing sunlight. "And get new nails, maybe a stronger latch for the windows. The storm won't always be kind." He looked at her, amused. "When did you become such a builder?" She laughed lightly. "When life decided to make me one." Her words lingered in the air, and James found himself smiling. Proud, a little awed. He took her hand, still damp from hanging clothes. "You've changed so much since the first time we came here." "So have you," she replied softly. "But I guess that's what storms do. They strip away what's weak and show what's strong." They shared a quiet look, the kind that didn't need words. Later that afternoon, the sound of approaching footsteps broke their silence. It was John, their neighbor, carrying a pair of boots slung over his shoulder. "Thought you two could use a hand," he called, his grin wide. James's expression lit up. "You came at the perfect time. The shed needs fixing, and I ran out of nails." John chuckled, setting down his tools. "Then let's fix what the wind broke." Diep brewed tea while the two men worked outside, their laughter echoing through the newly cleared yard. She watched them through the window, her heart swelling at the simple scene. Three people rebuilding what the storm had tried to take. When the shed was finally repaired, she brought them cups of hot tea. "To surviving our first storm here," she said, raising her cup playfully. "To many more," John added with a wink. James laughed, clinking his cup against theirs. "Let's hope not too many." They drank, letting the warmth chase away the last trace of the cold night. As the day waned, a golden light bathed the house, and for the first time, it felt truly alive. Messy, imperfect, but theirs. That evening, Diep and James stood by the porch, watching the stream that had caused them so much worry. It was calm now, its surface glimmering like glass under the fading sun. "You think it's safe to cross tomorrow?" Diep asked. James nodded. "If the rain stays away, yes. But I kinda like it here tonight," he admitted, his voice low and content. She smiled, leaning against him. "You just don't want to go back to the noise." "Maybe," he murmured. "Or maybe this place already feels like home." The sky darkened, and fireflies began to flicker among the grass. The house glowed softly behind them, light spilling through the windows. Warm, inviting. Diep rested her head on James's shoulder. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked quietly. "A year ago, we didn't even know if we'd have enough to buy land. And now..." James tightened his arm around her. "Now we're here. Not just because of luck, Diep. Because we didn't stop trying." Her eyes shimmered. "You always find the right words, don't you?" He chuckled. "That's because you give me something worth fighting for." They stood there in silence, listening to the steady rhythm of the water. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the wind carried the faint smell of rain-soaked grass. "Let's go inside," Diep whispered finally. "You promised you'd rest tonight." He smiled, letting her pull him toward the door. Inside, the house looked different now. Still bare, but alive with laughter and warmth. The flickering lamp painted golden ripples on the walls as they sat down to eat the simple meal Diep had cooked. "Tomorrow," James said between bites, "we'll bring Nye here. She'll love it." Diep nodded, picturing their daughter running barefoot through the small yard, laughing as she chased butterflies. She'll finally have a place that's ours. After dinner, they cleaned up together, their movements easy, wordless. The storm's chaos felt like a distant memory. Before bed, Diep walked to the window. Outside, the moon glowed faintly through the clouds, casting silver light over the damp earth. She smiled, whispering to herself, "We made it." James came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "We did," he said quietly, pressing a kiss to her hair. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of crickets and the faint drip of rainwater from the roof. And in that stillness, they both felt it, the peace that comes after every storm. The next morning would bring more work, more challenges, maybe even another downpour someday. But for now, in their fragile, rain-scarred house, James and Diep knew one thing for sure. They had weathered the worst together. And as long as they had that, no wind, no flood, and no storm could ever take their home away.